The advantage of coming at late notice to a conference is I didn't have time to prepare a formal speech. The other advantage, I suppose, of coming from the other side of the world is I'm suffering from quite acute jet lag at the moment, which a colleague of mine explained to me at 4 o'clock this morning. That will always liven up a conference, get a sleepless expat to tell them what's wrong with their country. I thought the title of this conference is very interesting, Reforming and Rebuilding Our State. I hear the sound of Conor Cruise O'Brien laughing from the grave at the institutionalisation of the 26-county state as the nation, and simultaneously hear the sound of Charles J. Haughey spinning in his grave in disgust. I bring up Charles J. Haughey because I wrote, in a previous life, I wrote Charles J. Haughey's biography, and I was given the telephone number of his private office in Concealy. And what I didn't realize, it wasn't just simply the private office number, it was the telephone on his desk. And I had spent many hours preparing what I was going to say, to explain to Charles J. Haughey why I wanted to speak to him. And I had a whole speech rehearsed, everything was fine, and I picked up the phone, and he had a very distinctive voice, and he answered, yes. I said, oh, Mr. Haughey. And he said, yes. Who's calling? I said, this is history calling. And he went, tell me more. So I persuaded him that he should talk to me about the arms trial initially, and what he wanted to achieve with the funding that went ultimately to the Provisional IRA. And then I ultimately wanted to ask him about how he managed to survive all the heaves against him. And this was quite problematic for Haughey to speak to, because at the time he was telling the McCracken Tribunal he could remember nothing. He was an old man, but he brought me down, and I used to go and see him once a month down in Concealy. And he would remember every single battle, every night. I remember the steamed chicken on the menu that particular night. And what struck me about Haughey, without taking a value judgment one way or the other on him, was that here was a master of the black arts of politics, a master of the machinations of politics. And it's a history that we do well to remember. Because one of the things that struck me throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s was the paucity of our institutional memory. The fact that we were being told in the tribunals of inquiry precisely what happens when you have bad governance within banks, precisely what happens when you have a corrupt nexus between politicians and developers, and it was going on around us at the time. And get this, here's the problem. Whose responsibility is this? It's your responsibility. It's the nation's responsibility. I was never more humiliated in my life than in 2009 when the bailout was emerged. I was in New York. And I would have a series of meetings with Wall Street bankers, and they just laughed. How could Ireland have been so stupid? You didn't really believe it, did you? What happened when we tried to stop? What happened when we tried to say something about this? What happened to me in 2006 when I reported serious problems with the governance of the International Financial Services Centre in Dublin was I was called in for re-education by the regulator at the time. And this centred on a reinsurance scandal, which was done, manipulated, out of Dublin, out of the subsidiary of a major international insurance company. And this wasn't just a rogue trader. This was the head of the Dublin Insurance and Management Association, a special advisor to the Taoiseach, no less, about the importance of the International Financial Services Centre to Ireland, and of course to the personal fortunes of those who were bankrolling it. The scandal focused on the manipulation of earnings for a major US company. But it transpires that 5 years previously, the same people organised a very similar accounting manipulation in Australia, which is now my home. So there was an investigation in Australia. There were attempts to call the people who were responsible for this to give evidence to a Royal Commission of Inquiry, very similar to a Tribunal of Inquiry here. And the people responsible decided no, they weren't going to come because they were busy. Why were they busy? They were busy turning Ireland into the Bermuda of Europe. That Ireland would do exceptionally well by playing with light touch regulation, no touch regulation. Hey guys, come to Ireland, it's fine, the tax won't touch you. This is the story again and again. So when the Australians asked them to come and give evidence, they said no, they weren't coming. The investigation found that this was corrupt. The people in charge were banned from operating in the Australian context. The information was provided to the Irish regulator, and the Irish regulator did the sum total of nothing about it. So when I was brought in for re-education, how dare I write in the Irish Times about this, I was told, but what about the damage to the International Financial Services Centre? This is serious, serious stuff, Justin. I said, why didn't you go to Australia, to the Royal Commission of Inquiry? We're a small regulator with a small budget. We couldn't afford to. This interview was recorded. It was on the record. That was the reason why I went in and agreed to the re-education. We then decided that we were going to run this in the Irish Times. And all hell broke out. Complaints to the Irish Times that this should not be published, because they were unaware that the Irish Times might actually publish it. That the interview was given under false pretenses. Of course, I was writing for academic journal articles, so this was just a byproduct of how we published these things. But I tell the story because it tells you a very interesting story about how things went wrong and why it's still and they remain problematic. So last year I was asked by this government, would I be part of the diaspora and come to Dublin Castle and speak about how potentially Ireland could change. And I said, sure, I'll come. I think there's a great opportunity for Ireland at the moment. Having been the most lax jurisdiction in Europe, having seen its economy be destroyed, its reputation trounced, and in actual fact now, under the stewardship of the IMF and the European Union. I disagree with Michael in relation to the IMF, in relation to their view of the austerity agenda, which we can go into in questions afterwards. But here was an opportunity for Ireland to totally change how it's seen in the world. And how it's seen in the world through the integration of 5 key components of reform, whether this is in the financial sector space or whether it's in the political space. And those 5 key factors or dimensions are compliance, ethics, deterrence, accountability, and risk. It is in the interest of the regulator and the regulated that you have substantive compliance, not technical compliance, where you transact around the rules. Find me a rule and I'll find a clever lawyer who will transact around it. Equally, you can't rely on principles if the people you are regulating don't actually operate with principles. It's a bit of a contradiction in terms. It's in the interest of the regulator and the regulated that you have warranted commitment to high ethical standards, not stated commitment to high ethical practice, which in actual fact is not how you run your business. It's in the interest of the regulator and the regulated that you have effective deterrence. Now, it's interesting now that the support for the Quinn Empire is beginning to fragment. But remember when Matthew Elderfield, the financial regulator, decided to take action against the Quinn Group prior to the election and the political pressure that was placed on the regulator for doing that? Institutional memory. It's important to remember. It's also in the interest of the regulator and the regulated that you have enhanced accountability. That those who break the law will, in actual fact, be sent to jail. But we also have to remember that these scandals are not just the result of rotten apples, change the players and everything will be all right. We've seen far too many scandals repeating time after time after time for that defense to be useful. And ultimately, we need to reduce risk. We need to reduce risk because unless we do reduce risk, we will not be in a position to safeguard our futures. We need to rebuild social capital. And this at a time of huge economic stress. I'm in Europe at the moment because there's a major scandal involving the banks, the LIBOR scandal, price manipulation. This is a very, very serious scandal, which has huge implications. It is as big as the collapse of Lehman Brothers. The consequences globally are going to be huge. And guess what? The sovereigns broke. How are we going to pay to get ourselves out if this crisis mutates ever more dangerously? There's a writer called Stephen King, not the horror novelist, but the chief economist from HSBC Bank, so perhaps this is a horror story after all. He's written recently about the emergence of what he calls a new southern Silk Route. This is trade between emerging and emerged markets. HSBC has got a very clever strategy, marketing strategy at the moment, saying we believe a bank should know when a market has emerged. Subtext for HSBC perhaps in the past is that's when we can sell them dodgy arms deals and get around anti-money laundering provisions. But the point is a serious one. The point that Stephen King makes is a very serious one. There are profound geopolitical and economic shifts happening in the global economy, which will see the dominance of Western Europe and the dominance of North America begin to decline. We are witnessing the beginning of that decline. As these countries trade more and more with each other and develop their regional financial services centres, they do so because they believe that they cannot trust the Western system to deliver. There is no need to go for Western markets. And guess what? There's no money to pay for the goods in the first place. In large measure, the US economy is surviving today because of Chinese forbearance. The biggest single holder of US debt is the Chinese government. We do well to remember our past. We do well to think of the future. And it seems to me the only way we can do that is to have a higher standard of political literacy. Perhaps Conor Cruise O'Brien was right, after all. Thanks.